Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Nowhere Yudaris. Today we'll be going through learning and memory under the behavioral science subject. Learning and memory, we're going to go through the type of learning theories. We're going to go through memory theories and what kind of memory processes we have, and what kind of memories are related to long-term, short-term, etc., etc. So stick by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And this is your host, Mahmoud Noor. Let's get started. So basically, we're gonna start with learning. So habituation is part of learning, in which you kind of repeated exposure to the same stimulus, causing a decrease in response. So for instance, I'll give you an example. A person moves into a noisy neighborhood, alright, and the person becomes less responsive to the sound of passing cars because they're being exposed to it repeatedly over and over. It's basically like you get exposed to a certain stimulus, it's like you don't care anymore, okay? Like your brain kind of low-key blocks it out. Then you have the opposite of that, which is this habituation, is the recovery of the response to a stimulus after the habituation occurs. And this happens when you get used to a stimulus and then a new stimulus enters your life and gets introduced, causing a new response. Next, we have associative learning. So associative learning is basically creating association between two stimuli or behavior and a response. And then the first type of that is classical conditioning, and this is biological and instinctual response to create association between two unrelated stimuluses or stimuli that work by having unconditioned stimulus, for instance meat, and unconditioned response, so salivating over food. So basically classical conditioning, you create a connection between two stimulus. So you have an unconditioned stimulus. What's an unconditioned stimulus? Kind of like no condition required for it to be activated or stimulated. And then you have an unconditioned response, is that you don't really have to alter that response or do something to it. It's like an automatic life kind of response. Next, we have one of the most like famous and significant experiments done. If you've never heard of it, maybe you watched The Office, you've seen Jim's prank on Dwight. It's Pavlov's dog acquisition experiment. And this experiment is basically an unconditioned stimulus, which is, for instance, the meat, where Pavlov rings a bell, causing no reflexive response. So there's a neutral response, right? So it has um, meat, and then Pavlov rings the bell, right? It wants the dog to react to the bell, but because it didn't get used to it yet, there is no response. It's a neutral stimulus. But after a number of tries, the bell rings and the dog salivates. So turn the neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus. All right, so that's ringing the bell. So now there's a condition to activate it, and the conditioned response, which is the salvation, is now an unconditioned response. So if before the bell, for the conditioned response of salvation, the meat needed to be there, but now only ringing the bell, the dog can salivate. So the new condition response can extend if the conditioned stimulus is present with an unconditioned stimulus. What does that mean? It means that, let's say you keep ringing the bell, and then the dog comes and then responds to the bell but doesn't get any food, it'll get extinct. The new behavior is going to get extinct. Next, you have operant conditioning, which is how consequences of voluntary behavior change the frequency of those behaviors. So you got how reinforcement and punishments affect our behaviors. Reinforcement is the process of increasing the likelihood of an animal performing a behavior. And then there's negative reinforcement, increasing the frequency of the behavior by removing something unpleasant. You have positive reinforcement. Okay, so Timmy gets an A plus on his test. So here you go, Timmy, and you a RC car, for instance, or a new toy. That's positive reinforcement. And then, for instance, I don't know, a negative reinforcement is like increase. It's like, oh, I would say with negative reinforcement, so let's say a dog um, gets shocked, for instance, all right? And then you remove the shocking collar, all right? That's like kind of negative reinforcement. And then we'll discover punishment, positive and negative in next slide. Escape learning is also part of negative reinforcement, where the animal experiences unpleasant stimulus and displays behavior to trigger the removal of the stimulus. So I want to give you an example about that. Let's say a person accidentally touches a hot stove and feels sharp pain. Are they gonna keep touching the hot stove or no? So in order to escape the pain, the person quickly withdraws their hand and learns from this experience. That's why it's called escape learning. It escapes the heat, escapes the pain. And then you have avoidance learning. So that's part of negative reinforcement where the animal avoids the unpleasant stimulus, and this develops from multiple escape learning experiences. So avoidance learning, or let's say, I don't know, you walk into a forest and then a group of people mug you or come up and try and rob you, for instance. So you use avoidance learning and then you don't go down the same pathway again, because if you do, they're going to be waiting for you, so you take another pathway. That's avoidance learning, for instance. Like I said, we're going to be talking about punishment. So punishment is use of conditioning to reduce the occurrence of the behavior. There is positive punishment, adds unpleasant consequence to reduce the behavior. So like, if you keep acting poorly or keep displaying bad behavior, I'm going to I don't know, I would say kick you out of the house, send you to a camp, that kind of deals with that stuff. And then you got negative punishment, removes the stimulus to reduce the behavior. So hey, Timmy, you've been getting bad grades on your tests, so I'm going to remove your access to your phone and your TV until you get your grades back up. So that's negative punishment. Next, you have reinforcement schedules, and these depend on whether the schedule can be fixed variable, interval, or ratio. So you got fixed ratio, which reinforces the behavior after a specific number of behavior performances, and continuous reinforcement. So let's say every time the action is done, the behavior is rewarded. So let's say every time a rat presses a button, he's given like a snack, a treat. Then you got variable ratio, so reinforces the behavior after varying number of performances. So let's say every time a rat, I don't know, presses the button 2 times, I'm gonna give him a reward. Every time he presses the button 6 times, I'm gonna give him a reward. So something like that. So that's variable ratio. Next you have fixed interval. So that is a reinforcement after a certain period has passed. So a specific period, a specific fixed period. So every 60 seconds, I'm going to give this rat a snack, for instance. Next, you got variable interval. So it reinforces behavior first time that's performed after varying time. So a rat is rewarded after 30 seconds, and then, let's do it 90 seconds, then 60 seconds. So that's variable interval. Next we have Latin learning. So basically you're learning without reward but demonstrate when reward is introduced. So I would say, for instance, oh yeah, you've been learning about chemistry all year, so and then it comes to an opportunity. There is I don't know, a science fair or like a competition where you can display your knowledge, and then there is reward for that. Or for instance, you can display your knowledge when the teacher asks a question. Next, you have observational learning, so a process of learning new behavior or information by watching others um, perform it or watch the behavior of others. And this is defined by a simple example called the Bobo doll experience. So children observed adults go into a room full of toys, and out of the toys, they picked up a clown and beat it up. Okay, when they were let into the room, the children, when they were let into the room, they avoided the clown or beat up the clown. They learned from the behavior of the adults that the clown is kind of like a negative stimuli, and they have a negative response to it. Next we have encoding. Encoding is the process of putting new information, sensory information, into our memory and making it active, making a use of it. Alright, so there's automatic processes, the unintentional knowledge gain, and then you have the control process, active memorization, so gaining more experience and practice. Could be evident by like, oh yeah, you're studying for your MCAT right now, you're doing Anki, you're doing this, you're studying new information, so that's control process, active memorization. And then there is various encoding ways. There's visual encoding, seeing it, acoustic, you're hearing it, elaborative encoding, and this turns into semantic encoding, put into meaningful context. And we're going to be speaking about semantic memory also. So these encodings are used, they're basically knowledge or concepts, and they're being stored as semantic memory. Next we have human memory. So human memory is divided into three parts: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Alright, short-term memory preserves information in its original form for a short period of time. It is said to be less than a second. So let's say you're going through a book real quick and then you notice something, less than a second you forget it. There are two types of sensory memory. Iconic memory is the visual decay, visual stimuli decay, and then you got echoic memory, so fast decaying memory of auditory stimuli. Iconic memory, you see, I don't know, something and then you forget about it a second later. Echoic, you hear something and then you forget about it a second later. And then you have short-term memory, which fades quickly over 30 seconds of not rehearsing it, and it has a memory capacity of like 7 things plus or minus 2 things, and is stored in the hippocampus. Hippocampus is a really significant a part of like the endocrine and part of the brain. It's a really significant thing, because throughout like nervous system, endocrine system, a lot of systems, it kind of like, I would say, um, like it's a mastermind. Hippocampus is the mastermind. Working memory then is supported by the hippocampus and helps us keep information in our consciousness. So that's short-term memory. For instance, do simple math in our heads for like a minute and then like move on to the next question, stuff like that. Then we have long-term memory. Long-term memory is the elaborative rehearsal of the from the short-term memory and then into a long-term memory, and keeps the information is kept at forefront and is controlled by the hippocampus. So the long-term memory is divided into two. You got the explicit memory and the implicit memory. Explicit memory is basically conscious memory, and then implicit is unconscious. So with the implicit, non-declarative, it really has to do with skills, habits, conditioned responses, things we don't consciously recall. So skills that you've learned throughout your life, things that you just know how to do. You don't really have to access your brain and then get to the process. You just know how to do this. You're the person for it. Okay, and then you got implicit memory goes down and it's into procedural memory, so relates to unconscious memory of skills required to complete tasks. For instance, ride a bike. Let's say you've learned how to ride a bike when you were 10, all right, and you haven't ridden a bike since then. You're like 20 now, all right. You're not gonna forget how to ride the bike. Okay, you're gonna maybe need a little bit of practice, but you're gonna know how to ride the bike. Next you have priming, which is exposure to like stimulus influencing response later. So example, color yellow for instance influences how you perceive the world in a certain way. Next you have explicit memory, which is declarative memory, and this requires conscious recall. So explicit memory really has to do with like the information, what you study, events and stuff like that, and experiences. So episodic memory, recollection of life experiences and events, okay? So episodic memory, you're sitting down with your friends, you're chit-chatting, okay? And then you're like, oh, I have a story. So this one time I went out with this girl, blah, 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 blah. That's episodic memory, all right? You're recalling events. Next you have semantic memory. So semantic memory refers to the ideas and the concepts and the facts that we know but cannot relate to life experiences. So right now you're studying for your MCAT, and then all the information, the encoding, the visual encoding, the auditory encoding, it's turned into the semantic memory, stored in the semantic memory with the rehearsal. You're rehearsing it and it's stored into the semantic memory. Memory disorders can leave one type of memory but affect others. So for instance, a person can forget how to ride a bike. So like I said, the example, like I said, it's been 10 years. I'm like, probably I forgot how to ride a bike. I don't know how to ride a bike. Episodic. You like go back to 10 years back. Oh, I used to ride a bike. I used to be the best bike rider in my age, for instance. And you forget the bike parts. I don't remember. Is that the steering part wheel? Is that the spring? What is that? That's the seat, right? But then when you get on the bike, you're able to ride it. So it affects the uh, explicit memory, but leaves the implicit memory. You know how to write it. You don't know how, but unconsciously you do know how to write it. Next, you have flashbulb memory. So it's a mix of episodic and semantic, and it's a detailed recollection of stimuli immediately surrounding important event. Next, you have relearning. So the longer number of times between relearning sessions. So let's say you're doing your Anki, and then you finish the review after 4 days, and then you see later it's like 13 or 20 days later, and then you're like, why is it that far? Because the greater the retention of information, the longer the number of times between relearning sessions, the greater the retention of information. So let's say there's like 20 days between this and that. Oh yeah, so when I remember it, I'm gonna have better retention. This is called spacing effect. Next, you have Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's is one of the most common memory loss what do you call it, memory loss diseases, and it's basically the loss of acetylcholine in neurons that link to hippocampus. Acetylcholine is also really significant because it's related to the parasympathetic system as well, and a lot of systems. So thank you so much for tuning in. Let me know if you have any questions, any concerns. This was Mahmoud Noer, and please do leave any comments or topics you want me to cover. Have a blessed day.